Welcome back to another episode of Radical Narrative. I am your host, Milan Tatusis, coming at you from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, Treaty 6 territory. Today on the podcast, I am sitting down with Caitlin Erickson. Caitlin Erickson is a determined advocate and former student of the Legacy Christian Academy, a school located here in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. Along with other former students, she has taken legal action against the school and its parent church organization, seeking justice for very real abuses that have taken place there at the school. Caitlin has faced threats and acts of vandalism. However, she does remain resolute in her mission to bring about positive change and support for students who have experienced the abuses taking place there. There's a lot to this story. There's a lot of information. I want to give out a straight up trigger warning that there is references to abuse in this podcast. And there's some interesting ties and references to Texas, of all places. So for our Texas listeners, this is something you will want to listen to. So this is Caitlin's journey, truth, justice, and ongoing advocacy and awareness of, basically, as Caitlin puts it, a cult that exists here in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. This ties into settler colonialism, so be sure to put your critical thinking caps on. I hope you enjoy this episode, and as always, be sure to stay tuned and listen in. Awesome. Welcome to Radical Narrative, Caitlin. It's great to have you. I'm going to let you go ahead and jump into introducing yourself.
Sure. I'm Caitlin Erickson. Thank you for having me. I know we've never met in person, but I'm a big fan of your sister. She's one of my best employees. She's, great person. We connected, I guess, over a few things in the last little bit here. We've both gone through house fires, and we also, I don't want to speak too much for you, but I think have a bit of a distaste for religious institutions running schools.
Yeah, a little bit of a connection there and observing what you're doing currently, what we're going to get into in the podcast for sure. In particular around the reality that there is still abuse taking place at religious schools in a time of reconciliation and a time of looking at the history of residential school, and not to take away from that conversation, obviously, but to recognize that, hey, this paradigm, this system, this abuse still takes place today in society. So how can, we even have conversations about the past when there's still very, really problematic things taking place? But we're going to get into that later in the podcast. I want you to introduce yourself, tell us who you are, where you come from, a bit of background about yourself.
Sure. So I was born and raised in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, and I pretty much lived there my whole life. We did briefly leave when I was about 10 to Kelowna, and we came back within, I think it was 6 months. So it was a very brief time. But other than that, pretty much been raised here in the prairies. I've done a fair bit of work as an adult in CBOs, nonprofits, and then working for the Ministry of Justice. So that's kind of where my path has taken me. And I have 6 kids that are at home. Large family.
Large family. That tends to come up as an interesting conversation online for you, right? And we're going to talk a little bit about you doing social media, but people tend to throw that in your face in a negative way.
Yeah. And it's hard I have 6 at home, and I have 1 that has graduated out of the house and he's an adult. And then I had my nephew living with me for a while too. So people tend to see the number of children and they're, obviously have negative opinions, which is wild, or assumptions on how these children came to be. So Yeah, for sure. Definitely. And then also, I like how you position yourself coming from the prairies. I mean, that's really big, aspect of our podcast, as we do talk about what takes place out here, because obviously there's a lot of social issues, political issues, environmental issues that we tend to talk about here. But I also want you to, I guess, speak specifically to just lay the landscape out for us, for our listeners, in terms of somebody who may not be from Saskatchewan or doesn't even know that we're out here. It's very flat. I resided previously, I'm currently residing in Saskatoon, but I resided previously in North Battleford. And
Yeah, yeah. And I guess also that's where you met my sister Jelani, where she was working with you at the lighthouse, doing work there for a number of years, I want to say. But yeah, Battleford is an interesting place. It tends to come up in a lot of conversations, not only on the podcast, but also on the news.
That place, I've lived in a few different places in Canada. There's nothing like North Battleford. Just the dynamic there
Hmm.
is very, there's some really amazing people in the community that are trying to bring forth change, but it's also this black hole of toxicity.
Yeah.
So it's this really unique city, small city that's surrounded by all these First Nations communities. And it's almost like a big rural city, but so the dynamic is different.
Yeah. Yeah, there is a different dynamic out there in North Battleford area because it has a long history tied to, the settlement of the prairie, especially around Fort Battleford, and obviously the reality that our reserves are in that area, and that town, that small city being, the only central place where a lot of us have to go for groceries. A lot of us have to go to the bank. So it's like the urban center for the communities in the area. But with that, there's a lot of social factors play out in that town around, poverty, homelessness, houselessness, and the reality that a lot of people don't have homes to go to, so they tend to, congregate in town. And obviously, poverty and drug and alcohol addiction, mental health issues really playing out in our communities also that tend to make their way into that town. But there is a lot of racism.
There's just so much racism. And, I heard about it before moving there. There was a lot of, obviously, North Battleford's famous for its crime, being called Crime Town and being high on the crime stats index. But the racism there is a whole other level. And I think, too, I mean, we connected over, your brother's incident, which the reason I decided to take to social media about that, too, was just seeing people's comments, not like negating it. And it was like, no, like that's the reality for people living there. Like that is just a Tuesday there. It's awful. So yeah, a lot of racism in the province. There's a lot of people trying to do good things, but it's very rampant here.
Yeah, and for our listeners that aren't familiar, I know a lot of people follow me on social media, so they are familiar. But for those who aren't familiar, my brother was assaulted in
Mm-hmm.
North Battleford while he was returning a trailer into a friend's backyard, and he was stereotyped, assaulted. There's footage out there, there's photos out there. You could bring it up on a Google search. But interestingly enough, Adam Lesmeister, the guy who assaulted him, is getting sentenced today.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, we're sort of waiting to hear about that. I can't get out there to North Battleford because I'm in Saskatoon today and lots going on. But yeah, so that's an interesting dynamic that maybe I should also do a podcast on.
That is, yeah. But yeah, when I saw that, it was just infuriating. And it was infuriating seeing people trying to explain away or say stereotypical things. And it was like, I mean, I don't know your brother personally, but I have a bit of experience with your family. And so I don't know, I felt the need to stand up for him and just, I mean, at the same time, my children are, I have some that are registered to Sweetgrass out that way. And my children have experienced that. I mean, I've seen it firsthand. I've seen it going into stores. We've been in Costco and things have happened. So it's just ridiculous that at this point, people still try to negate that these things go on because they go on all the time.
Yeah, definitely. And that's part of what I think attracted my attention to you, your platform, and the message you're putting out there is that you're really critical in a very good way of what's taking place in the province, not only in terms of like the social dynamics, but also the political dynamics. Obviously, the premier of Saskatchewan is pretty much, I mean, Saskatchewan is going to hell in a hell basket, depending on who you talk to.
Yeah.
Lots going on out here. And then, yeah, that critical analysis that you have on social media was really refreshing to see. And then also, yeah, your support for, putting out that TikTok that sort of broke down what took place with my brother in North Battleford too. That was really cool to see. And then seeing the comments and obviously seeing the storm that you willingly go through sometimes too with the social media commentary on Facebook, on TikTok, on Twitter. It's all over the place. And then even seeing you butt heads with known sort of far right conspiracy theorists in Saskatchewan, and it's like, yeah, like you're doing it, you're leading the charge, and it's really cool. And that's probably why we wanted to platform you too, is because obviously, you're non-Indigenous, you're white passing, and you're leading the charge in that way, and we need more of that. So that was one of the reasons why we wanted to get you on here, was to say, hey, look at this person and what they're doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think every person who has the ability to should be using their voice for these things, because I mean, in my personal background and experience, the only reason why people continue to do the things they do is because people stay quiet and they don't say anything. Mm-hmm. And I think growing up in the environment I did of like fear and intimidation, to be blunt, it was like beat out of me. So I don't get intimidated by these people anymore. I don't have a fear. So engaging with them, some people sometimes message me and they're like, they'll see comments on social media and they're like, are you okay? Like, I would be crying in my room right now. And I'm like, honestly, it doesn't bother me. Like half the time I read those ridiculous comments and I laugh and I'm like, hey, this is so ridiculous. Like but yeah, there's a lot. I would say, especially those far right people, there's few of them and they're very loud. So there needs to be more voices for sure, talking about, I don't know, what's actually truthful, because there's a lot of BS flowing out that way.
Yeah, totally. And then I don't know what it is with like social dynamics in Saskatchewan, but it seems like a lot of just general people fall victim to a lot of social media miseducation, a lot of miseducation showing up, and it's kind of wild to see. And yeah, TikTok is like a front seat to it. Like you get a front seat to what's really taking place and what people are picking up on.
Yeah.
And yeah, and I guess you spoke specifically to, like, you put it pretty bluntly that, that you did have an experience growing up where, there was intimidation, there was abuse, there was violence, and anyone who could Google your name or Google Saskatchewan and your name, it's going to come up that you are actually leading the charge on exposing some of the abuse you experienced. And what really drew me in terms of my analysis and my understanding was that in Saskatchewan, we're apparently in this era of reconciliation. We're apparently in this era of looking at residential school history and trauma, and, people coming to terms with that. Like I just taught a 200 level history of residential school course for University of Regina social work, and people going through these emotions and learning the history, and it's really traumatic. It's emotional, obviously. But then at the same time, we're still dealing with the presence of a religious institution that is carrying forward harm and doing some pretty problematic stuff. And I even what really caught my attention too with you on social media was you even positioned it as like a cult vibe going on with the supporters and the culture that exists here. And that really like alerted my attention too, because that's settler colonialism. Like it still exists. There's still an organization that exists that's doing a lot and has a lot of power in this province. So yeah, can you speak to that? Can you speak to sort of, your experience of what took place in your past and how you, what led you to speak out about the abuse?
First off, before I really get into it, one thing that I've got a few times on social media, and I think your podcast is a great opportunity to kind of bring this up, is, I've had comments where people have commented and been, a little bit upset, and they're like, it's, you're speaking out about your experience at your abusive religious school, and, they didn't listen to people in residential schools when they spoke out, and, it took a huge court case and all this stuff, to happen for there to be a light, shone on it. And and you're correct, we're supposed to be going through reconciliation right now. But I honestly believe, I don't believe that if that whole process hadn't happened, no one would have listened to us. So I, give all of those survivors, I'm so thankful to them, because they really paved the way for us to be able to speak out about our experience. Because I don't even think 10 years ago, people would have listened to us, to be honest. And I've been out of that school for 17 years now.
Yeah. Yeah. So this organized religious school that is committing abuse and atrocities doesn't seem so far-fetched now in society, right? So the reality that, residential school conversations have been happening for a while, and then suddenly you coming forward is leading more people to realize, oh, okay, yeah, this is a problem, this is a thing. And we will talk a little bit about that later in terms of, even like you said, in the past, you did reach out to people who did not take these, the claims you were making seriously, did not take you seriously in terms of trying to report this. So let's take a step back. So you did attend a school here in Saskatoon called Legacy Christian Academy for a number of years. So let's start there.
I attended a private Christian school, for those who don't know, in Saskatoon. It was a K-12 school. It was run by the church that I attended. So half the building was a school, half the building was a church. It was all connected, but there was no distinction between church and school. It was one place. So there was a lot of stuff that went on. There was a lot of emotional abuse, psychological abuse, sexual abuse that happened, spiritual abuse, and physical abuse. And I think part of it too, so I didn't know a lot of it was completely illegal. Like, I didn't know that, because we were told growing up, this is legal, this, what we're doing is legal, because people would question that sometimes. So then the pastor would reiterate again, like over the pulpit, like, this is legal, what we're doing, this is within our right. But he would also make comments at the same time saying, like, we're above man's law, we follow God's law. Wow. So also indicating that maybe they knew what they were doing was wrong. So then I gently over COVID started talking about my experience. And when I did get some more information that what went on from K-12 was totally illegal. So I started gently talking about it, actually without mentioning the name of the school or any of the teachers. I got a bunch of DMs and a bunch of messages from people from another school. And they said, this sounds like this person where we attend school. And I was like, oh, and it was the former director of my school. He had opened another school, and it was students from that school that recognized the behavior and was like, this is going on in our school, and reached out to me. So that was just, okay, I need to come forward with this. Like, this is, and I'd kind of already made a decision that I was like, okay, I'm going to come forward. But it's like sitting down and trying to put 12 years of abuse that happened to you in school down on paper and trying to remember dates and everything. Like, that's difficult because there's so much that went on, and it was just part of the normal day to day. So that was our normal life for us. Yeah. And then there was a student that spoke out on social media and just said, talked about actually the individual who's going through criminal court right now, and said, how come we weren't told that this person is a pedophile? And I reached out to the person. I said, hey, I'm thinking about going forward to the police. If you're considering doing that, here's the information. And so I didn't hear back from that person for a while, and I went to police, and then like a month or two later, this person messaged me and said, I also went to police. I was like, okay, so there was like two of us. And then I really was only still in contact with maybe 2 to 3 people. So I reached out to them and I said, this is what I've done. So if you've decided you want to do something about it, go do it. And so they were like, yep, they went right away, went to the police, filed police report. So that just snowballed. And so there was like 18 students that had gone to police by the end of 2021, I believe it was. And then we made a decision. So then that group just grew. We made a decision that if the police hadn't charged them by August of 2022, that we're not letting those people have another school year without the public knowing who they are. So we went forward in August with CBC and we did a story. It became national news. There's been many news stories since then. We did not expect the positive support.
Yeah, a lot of positive support showing up online. And at the same time, people are starting to realize what really is taking place there. What was the turning point? Like, when did you realize, that, okay, first off, you're rocking the boat, but then you realize that there's wind in the sail, that, hey, this is something that is likely going to take off and we're justified in doing this?
Right. So, the ones of us that kind of came forward right off the hop, we were the ones that had been told over and over, we're rebellious kids, we're not good kids, we're bad eggs. And so even there was like, I think a little bit of guilt almost, but it's like wanting to tell your story, but like still having those overbearing, things in the background. But I know, and I know this, I've talked to a lot of people who went forward and they kind of echoed the same thing. Actually telling police the story and like the look on their face, like they're looking horrified and they're reading things back to me and from my statement. Like I wrote, I think it was like 30 pages of statement when I went in because I just started writing and it just kept pouring out of me. But it was, seeing other people's reaction to our stories. And it was like, okay, this is a lot more effed up than we knew it was, So that was really validating. But since then, we have secured Sharfsteins. So we have a legal team and we've launched a class action. And it's my last name on the class action. And we're suing 22 defendants right now. And the first court date's coming up in July for the class action. So things are rolling ahead. We have a judge that's assigned and a great judge. And and then the criminal process is going through for one former staff who's also listed in the civil action. And the police have told us there'll be more charges coming soon for other individuals. So ball's rolling. It's been a slow process, but ball is rolling.
Yeah, the ball's rolling, and you did a lot, and a lot of social change, social commentary. Like you said, there's been a lot of support. I'm assuming there's a lot of ghost supporters too out there that are probably supporting you in silence too. That's the vibe I get. But in my world, like observing it, not too many people are talking about it who are Indigenous. Whereas for me, it's kind of like I want to see what this cultures like that you're speaking about. I want to hear about it because it is pretty alarming. It was pretty alarming to hear. And again, it does correlate to sort of the experiences we've had with, the church and religious institutions in the province. But yeah, can you speak and provide like a picture for us who haven't grown up in the church or haven't grown up in any religious organization of like sort of like the culture or the social community that sort of plays out in those spaces that rationalize this and justify this? Like it was alarming for me to hear them position themselves as above man's law and rationalize and justify what they're doing, which could exist for multiple things. But that was alarming to hear.
Yeah. So I guess to kind of paint a picture, as someone who I started when I was 4 years old. So it was, pretty much I had one other, I think, social interaction in a normal, I think play school, was at a normal school. But then I was put into this school, and very quickly when we joined the church, it was very evident, and they would say this, your family is your church family. So if you have family that aren't Christians, or even family that may be Christians, but their beliefs don't line up with that particular church, you are not supposed to associate with them. So they, as you become a member there, because they're big on membership. So you had to, if you're an adult, you have to become a member of the church and you have to take membership classes. They just make that whole environment your whole world. So they start slowly isolating different things around you. So it's your family, it's your coworkers that aren't Christians, and your whole free time is just taken over by the church. So as a young person, you're in school, you're in the building Monday to Friday for school. Plus there's Tuesday morning prayer at 6 a.m. And then you have church on Wednesdays, church on Saturdays, church on Sundays. So you are in that building every single day. And they would do things to, like, they started their own summer camp because they didn't want us teenagers going to another summer camp where there's other Christian teenagers.
Wow.
Everything was in isolation.
Yeah, everything's in isolation. They're separating you from society, family members, and friends who aren't necessarily involved. Paint a picture for us then of what takes place in the classroom, because in our conversation, it's pretty alarming to hear what's going on there. So paint that picture for us, because people tend to assume it's a Christian school, but at the same time, there's something taking place there. Can you put words to that?
To paint a picture, if you don't know about these independent or private Christian schools. So the curriculum system is called ACE, Accelerated Christian Education. And this comes out of the States. And very obviously, Republican conservative type that wrote this curriculum. And this curriculum has had a lot of backlash for basically promoting colonization in the form of missionaries. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the whole curriculum, all these booklets are just intertwined with indoctrination. Sexism is in there. That's a huge thing. Classism, it's just awful. And this curriculum has actually been banned in several states. Wow. And so the pastor of the church, Keith Johnson at the time, he brought this curriculum to Canada, and he's from Plainview, Texas. So he came here in 1980, opened the church, and then opened the school in 82.
Yeah, that's amazing to hear, because I don't think people realize that there's this United States sort of southern state evangelical origin story here. I didn't know that until we started talking, but it's starting to make a lot of sense in terms of what you're explaining here. And by amazing, I mean it's weird to hear that this has origins in the United States, making its way north. That's alarming to me, to know that this exists in our territory. So what was it like in the classroom then? What was taking place for you as a student?
It was so stringent and rigorous. You'd come into class, the first thing you do is pray as a class. Then you're sitting in a cubicle, and these cubicles are not very big, and they have huge dividers on the side. So, and you're sitting you're sitting up against a wall. So you've got maybe 3 feet in front of you, maybe 2 to 3 feet. So, and you're in there the whole time from 9 o'clock till, we go for a recess, and then you're back in your cubicle. Then you have lunch, then you're back in your cubicle. So other than gym class or music class, that was kind of the only time you're out of the cubicle, or for a brief minute or two, because we had to score our own work. So we would have to do the work, go up to what was called a scoring station, and then score our own work. So this is really a homeschool curriculum, and it's a student taught. And then imagine anybody who has any sort of learning disability or English is their second language or anything going on, and then trying to sit in a desk and do this work.
Yeah, and that is your story too there, right? Can you speak to that a bit?
I was someone who, at the age of 4, I was, identified as she has ADHD. My mom didn't believe in medicating at the time. So, those are my first memories of my teachers getting angry with me. And some of the comments the one teacher would make is she'd say you're just as hyper as the boys. And it was a negative thing. And I remember my level 1 teacher getting so angry with me because I couldn't just sit down and do the work. And they would see if you couldn't perform academically, they would call it deliberate disobedience. You were making a choice to perform badly academically. So they would paddle kids. And this went on from kindergarten to grade 12. And they'd paddle kids if they weren't performing academically. And that was the majority of the reason that kids got paddled in that school, was actually school wanted everyone to hit these academic targets that were up here, and not everybody could hit those. That was a lot of, I would say, a majority of abuse. Then there was, a few people that didn't drink the Kool-Aid, and so they were not towing the line. So, and this is mostly single parent kids. And so they were spanked for everything and anything.
Yeah, that's alarming. And it's interesting for you to explain it in this way, because I did observe and experience that type of logic taking place, in particular from educators who went to residential school or day school. So it's triggered in that regard. And I know it's different circumstances and different people. Not everyone's trauma is the same. But it is alarming to hear this, and you apply this clarity to the problem and unpack it for us in terms of what you experience. So there is this observation and learning taking place, hearing you talk. But wow, it's like I knew that there was details like that. I think you really played it out well, because I think also like in the mind of in the mind of Indigenous people in this territory, I think there's also like this assumption that they don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to get involved. Like not too many people are, sharing or speaking to, the experience you went through, or even sharing that information. I feel like I'm one of the only ones. But when I hear you speak to it about that in that way, it is pretty triggering. It is really triggering for me, right? Because again, like I said, we are in this era of reconciliation and this era of people learning about residential school. But then at the same time, on the flip side, there's still children going through or having gone through this experience of an education system that's highly toxic, highly problematic, highly abusive. And then in my mind, like the balance doesn't exist in society for any sort of justice to take place, because the behaviors are still here. Like the behaviors in the system is still here. And even hearing you speak about the correlation of like this curriculum tied to this ACE curriculum tied to the United States coming out of Texas, it's like, yeah, this is a problem. This is a problem.
Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the reasons why this school was even a thing and became a thing was because they have a very specific relationship and discourse to politics, to government. Can you speak to that a bit?
This school opened in 82 and they were given the green light to open. Like they didn't have funding at the time, but I mean, this was Grant Devine era.
Yeah, the premier of Saskatchewan at the time was Grant Devine.
And so Grant Devine, like his leadership said, go ahead, open the school. And I mean, there just wasn't checks and balances in place for these types of schools to be operating. But then anytime that there was people in the community that were kind of pushing to be like, okay, what's going on at these schools? This school would cozy up with government. And there's, I mean, a huge correlation to like in high school, like we did campaigning for, like we would go door to door and deliver flyers for certain conservative MLAs or conservative mayor candidates in the city of Saskatoon. And we would have to stuff envelopes. And they would like literally take us. So we're supposed to be doing schoolwork. They would take us in the afternoon on like the 15 passenger school van to this MLA, potential MLA's office. And we would do work there. And then we get drove back by the time, it was time for our parents to pick us up. So there was some really bizarre things going on. And it wasn't like when we went there, it was like, okay, let's talk about politics. Let's talk about voting. Like, this is how, no, it was like, go sit down. Here's your 500 envelopes, go stuff them. And then, this person's going to do this. Like, that's how it was. It wasn't, as I've heard Maurice Bellicott make comments, because he was one who we, longtime conservative MLA in Saskatoon. And he's one that we did a lot of free labor for.
Yeah.
And, he's like, oh, it's an educational experience. Yeah, bullshit, Maurice. You were never there half the time. And when we were, doing stuff, you weren't talking to us, explaining, the democratic process.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely. Yeah. Child labor. Like, it's so like, it's wild. It's not wild. Yeah. It's believable when you hear it. It's like, okay, yeah, this makes sense. Right. What's wild is that it's like, it took place here. Right. And then, I mean, they say like they did the name changes and things like that. But I mean, yeah, the culture's still out there, right? That's what like really like kind of throws me a wrench in my mind. Is like, wow, there's people out there still who are doing this and have done this, and they're in the community, they're in the city, they believe these things, they support these things, and it's all around. And again, with me, being anti-colonial, decolonial, looking at it from my perspective, my history, it's like this is still a pretty major like concern and problem that probably is not necessarily going away, and that we have to be really mindful of. And I guess I want to ask you the question too, is like, you're talking about this history, this experience of you going through this school and obviously, it impacting you, but I want to sort of like get to the pinpoint time in your life where you came to realize that the school, even the religious aspects, the church was harmful, abusive. And like, what steps did you take to distance yourself from that group? Like, when was that turning point for you when you started to realize, okay, so this is a problem and I need to move away from this?
I mean, I think really it was when we left briefly and went to Kelowna when I was 10, and I went to another Christian school there and we were part of a church, but it was just so wildly different. Like it was like day and night. And I had certified teachers. They used public school education. It was the first time I'd ever been teacher taught. So that was a huge adjustment. And when I came back, I definitely like something in me changed, and I began to see more how abusive it was. So we returned just before my 11th birthday. And one of my classmates who I've reconnected, well, two of them actually who I've reconnected with, they told me, they said, when you came back, one of the first things you did was you told us girls, like, this individual is a pedophile, stay away from him, do not be alone with him. And like, so I was like 10, like I'm 10 and I'm telling my, classmates, like, look out for this person, because I had an experience, a few experiences with this person prior to leaving. So I'm like, yeah, that's kind of when the change happened. And then it was just really hard to reintegrate back into the cult after being out, because it was just like, this isn't normal. And it became just more apparent. So as I got older, obviously it was harder for them to control me. And and then I left a few weeks after graduation. I graduated from there, and at that point my mental health was garbage. Like, I was not doing well. I was very suicidal. I'd had a couple attempts at that point, and it was just really tough. They had, kicked out my best friend for being gay, and it was just really lonely and isolating. And it was like, I have two options. I can stay here and I'm not going to live much longer, or I can leave.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to like the quality of education you received there in terms of how they were setting people up for life. I mean, the only other option would be to stay, and you chose not to do that. And you ventured out into the world, right? You ventured out into the world. Explain to us what you did after graduation.
I found an ad in the paper saying that they were looking for housekeepers in Banff, Alberta. And I didn't have anywhere to live, but I had a job. So I packed up my car and I drove. And by the time, it was like 8 p.m. that night, I had a place to live. And then I stayed there for a year and a bit. So when I was there, I think I was there for about 2 or 3 months in Alberta. And I realized, like, everything was totally foreign to me. It was like being in another country. I didn't know how to be around people that weren't from my community. And I had to like watch other people to see how to fit in, because it was just like a fish out of water. And then I just went into a place where I was in Calgary with some friends. The one day we had days off, and I just went into this place and I was like, I don't know what I need, but I think I was in a cult and I think I need some sort of counseling. And so I did an intake with them, and they were like, yeah, you need a psychologist. You need someone who can do deprogramming. So that's when I started. So I am very fortunate because I was able to start kind of deprogramming and getting therapy right off the hop, like right after leaving. And a lot of people are just doing that for the first time. So I've been in therapy off and on for 17 years.
Yeah.
So
yeah, for real. And then, I mean, like, it's like next level in terms of like, you always hear people say like they had a horrible high school experience, but then you're talking about this whole like freaking indoctrination you experienced and you were there. And yeah, like the long-term, psychological impact of that, you speak into that's really important. And especially like to hear in terms of like, I feel like I'm not getting that in the media. Like, I'm hearing about the abuse and I'm hearing about these things that, in terms of the story, and of course the news stories, but it's really interesting for you to paint that picture of you having to live with this and still getting counseling, even, for 17 years, still obviously probably dealing with that trauma as it comes up, even with the court case being present. But one thing that attracts my attention, and we talked about this before, and you even mentioned it in the media, is that it's essentially a cult, right? And it required deprogramming. And with that being said, how far into, the extended community does this cult exist?
Well, at the time, I think around the time we joined, the church was at 350-ish. So it was a pretty decent sized congregation for Saskatoon. And then a few years after we joined, there was there was maybe like 30 to 40 people that left the church because due to financial fraud that the pastor was committing. and was kind of exposed on, so the church kind of would go through these ups and downs of like, they'd get an influx of new people, and then sometimes they'd have, a couple people leave. But the thing about leaving there though, is when you leave, like, you left for good. Like, you would not be welcome back. You were not, I mean, I've seen dozens of emails from former students who left as adults, and emails from people in church leadership telling them, like, you've made this choice to leave. I see no point in continuing our friendship. And these are like people we've known since we were toddlers, like, and they'll just cut you off like it's nothing. And so, I mean, if you left, I mean, not when I was there, we didn't have social media, but after, there's other people, they would just like, they'd get blocked by everybody from the church. And that was the culture there. And our pastor was like, our church is unique. Like, we are the it church, we're different than everybody else. And so even us, like, associating with other youth groups, that I can recall one time we went to another church when a youth group was having a thing, and that's it. And we were often told, like, they're not even as Christian as they need to be. And so that wasn't even good enough for us to hang out with other Christians in the city. So that's like how small our bubble was. So like, I pretty much, minus one or two people, the same people from when I started when I was 4 to when I graduated. So they're like siblings. Like, it's like, way more than you want to know about these people. And all of your childhood memories are with them in school and out of school.
Yeah. And then, so with this picture you painted with in terms of community, everyone knowing each other, but they're still active participants in the community, right? So they have jobs. They're obviously like working out there in Saskatoon.
Yeah, they do. I mean, there's a large number that were employed with the church and school. So that was kind of a thing too, because they didn't want, they like to keep people as close as they can. After high school, it was mandatory to go to Faith College, which was their 2-year Bible college. And they dissuaded people from going to post-secondary until they've gone to Bible college. Women, they dissuaded like from going to university, period. But men, it was okay for them to go once they did 2 years of Bible college. That even was like another 2 years of just keeping you in the building and control. So, and I was terrified that I was going to get sent to Faith College too. So that was another reason for leaving, because I was like, there's no way, there's no way I can do another 2 years with these people.
Yeah. So personal question, again, answer if you want. You don't have to answer, you can edit it. But personal question. So why did you stay? Like, you structured as a cult, it's there. Can you speak to the reasons why you were staying? Why it was difficult to leave? What existed there in that space?
Well, when they isolate you, and they do it so slowly over time, they isolate you from everybody. You don't have anybody else. So you don't have people that you could just be like, I'm getting out of here and I'm going. And I mean, I am very thankful for my grandparents. They are not religious, and they always kind of were the voice of reason. And I have some other family members who are academics who have always kind of were like, maybe you should think about that a little more, question things a little more, when it was, we were talking about anything, going on in the world, and I would just regurgitate like a baby bird, whatever the pastor had said. So, I mean, I did always have them as a really strong support in my life. But during the time when things got really, really bad, they were living in the Middle East. So my grandpa had retired here, and he was, head of X-ray actually at all 3 hospitals. And so he retired, they took this other job, and there just wasn't any outside support, I guess, at that time. And we were also taught to basically be in fear that if we spoke out, that they were going to take us away from our families. That was a fear that was always put on us. So we were scared to speak out. So I would do it anonymously. I would walk across to Lawson Heights pool there and the wave pool and the library, and I would call social services, and I wouldn't give my name, but I would call social services and I'd be like, this is what's going on. And they were like, yeah, we need names, we need specifics. And I'm like, no, like, just come in. You'll see the paddle in the desk in the principal's office. Like, I was like, talk to the students. And I mean, I don't ever remember a social worker being in the building, or if they were, maybe it was hidden from us. Like, we didn't know that's who it was, but I did. And I called Saskatoon police at one point too. And they said, well, you have to come down and give a statement. And I was like, I was like 15 at the time. And I was like, I can't, like, I live on the north end. I can't drive down there. Like, I can't come down and make a statement. And then I also reached out to a family member's friend that worked for Global Saskatoon at the time too. And he was considering doing a story, but he was like, you would have to go on the record. And I was like, well, I can't. Like,
Yeah, and that's not dealing with like the isolation and distancing that you would experience if you did go through successfully exposing what was taking place at that time.
If you left and you had siblings still in the school, those siblings were not allowed to have contact with you. So I'm the oldest in my family. I have 2 younger sisters, and then I have some step siblings, but just the thought of not being able to see them was enough to keep me from leaving. So my sister, though, my middle sister, the middle sister in our family, she got kicked out when she was I was in grade 9. So at the time, that was horrific for me, because then I wasn't allowed to have contact with her. But I still had a younger sister too that, you know, it blew up families. You either had to all leave and be degenerates all together and leave the church. You couldn't have one member leave, because then you never have contact.
Yeah, and this would be under the project of control dominating, you know, what you do, what your family does, all under this church model.
I mean, that's one thing on social media too. People often say, like, what's going on with the parents? Like, how did they not, you know, do anything? And I mean, my mom was a single mom, and during the brief time that she was married to my stepdad, like, the director of the school was physically abusive to my stepdad. I mean, he slammed him up against a wall, like, in front of me, and screamed at him. And like, he was totally nuts. And it's like, as a child, you're seeing that being done to an adult, and you know that, I mean, these people have hurt you before, so you know they have the power to do it again. Wow. It was really difficult, and especially for women to speak up and say anything. And then again, it's the same for these people. So they make everything with the church and the school your whole life. So if you stand up to them, you know, you're not going to get that support, you know, you need, or even just, they brainwash the parents to, like, second guess, like, are you really in God's will? And then if the parents started, this is something they used to do to the older teenagers. If your parents started speaking up on your behalf, the leadership of the church would come to you as an older teenager and be like, so your parents aren't in God's will right now. They're really, like, fallen off the path of God. So we think you should stop listening to them. So the amount of energy they put into manipulation and control was just next level.
Yeah, this is like Netflix documentary series vibe. How you're explaining
That's the ongoing joke. We're like, this is turning into one of those bad Netflix series.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, it's like, it's pretty alarming to hear, you know, the stories coming out and what's taking place. And even like you positioning and saying, and obviously telling our audience that you actively reached out to people, social workers, you actually reached out to police, and like, there wasn't really any initial way, or they didn't respond. Like, they obviously didn't respond, right? And then I guess that even came out, that was also evidence in terms of how, you know, I guess the province I'll ask that as the question is, how do you feel like the province of Saskatchewan has responded to the allegations of abuse at the school and in this religious organization?
Well, I've been speaking in the media for the last 2 days on how they responded, which is
Hmm.
not great.
Yeah.
Honestly, I don't know. Maybe I was a bit naive initially. I thought when we brought this stuff to their attention, because I mean, it wasn't just like, hey, this happened. Like we brought, evidence, facts, said you can talk to several different students. We gave them all the information, and I actually thought that they would be like, oh, okay, holy crap, like let's get a handle on this. But I mean, on the other side of things, we know that there's been significant political involvement too. So, but it was like at the time, I guess some of it too was a little bit like, was the political interference like as bad as, some people are saying it is?
Hmm.
So I thought that the province was going to respond better. They didn't. And it's just been actually wild to see how blatant the Minister of Education, his bias is with this, and how strong he's willing to go to bat for these schools. Like he is willing to double down on things. It is wild. Like it is wild.
Yeah, it's pretty, like, in my mind, it's cut and dry, right? You see it, you hear it, it's there. Now there's obviously like they're moving forward with, charges and the court cases and everything like that's moving ahead, but you're still sourcing like the province, like you said, just kind of like double down. And in my mind, like from the Indigenous perspective of things, it's like, man, this is not the vibe of like the people we want to be working with in an era of reconciliation. Like this is like, how could any sort of social change come out of, obviously, not only just the government in play, but just in general, this consciousness and this paradigm that exists around the experience you're talking about. Like there is, in my mind, like obviously like a culture of silence, or even like a culture of support, or even turning the blind eye. Like, no, like that can't happen. Like these are good law abiding citizens type vibe, let's turn the blind eye for so long. For so long. So it does, in my mind, is a social indicator of, what's taking place in Saskatchewan and how it functions culturally. And of course, there's obviously going to be good people out there. There's obviously good on the ground workers doing support who are aware. But again, like politically and socially, there's some indicators here that we got a major problem.
I think that's an amazing point, and that's very pertinent because it's like you can kind of see that it's just surface fluff. Even what they're trying to do for they say they're engaging in reconciliation, but it's just fluff. Yeah. Deep down in their roots, they're still in 1940, 1920.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like some of the Instagram comments we get when I talk about Saskatchewan or they hear about Saskatchewan, it is kind of alarming for them to hear that we're out here in the middle of nowhere. And it's almost like there's a kind of a culture shock when they start to speak about it, or when they start to hear us speak about it. Because there's listeners in Toronto who say, hey, we heard Saskatchewan's like this, and we're like, yeah, it kind of is like that. But then also there's a lot of layers to this onion.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. It is easy, I think, to like, oh yeah, we're flatland, redneck, racist people. Mm-hmm. But I feel like there has been a movement of more people that are, educated, I guess, to speak on these things, that are putting their voice forward. And not all of Saskatchewan is like that. And I mean, I'm born and raised in Saskatoon, and I didn't live in Saskatoon for a long time because it was just triggering driving on the north end of Saskatoon and seeing like the possibility of running into any of these people just gave me a lot of anxiety. And I stayed away from where I was born and raised, and I've been back since November, and it's actually been amazing and like a breath of fresh air. And it's like, and like I let these people control that aspect of me being in my home community and being close to my friends and family because of the trauma they caused me. So it was like getting that power back and like enjoying Saskatoon, enjoying, all the different things the city has to offer, and being able to do it without that anxiety. And it's kind of ironic now. I mean, I've heard from other people that I guess people who are still at the church have seen me and like are like, oh, I'm scared, I don't want to run into her.
Flip the script on them.
it's like this reverse dynamic of power now,
Yeah.
which is like, I'm like, oh, I would still like, if someone came up and talk to me, I would talk to them. If it was someone who is listed on the statement of claim, know your place and don't come and cause further trauma than you already have. But yeah, it's just, it's one of those things. It's funny to see how things have changed.
Yeah, definitely. And then especially me, like educating and, being an instructor here at university for like a number of years, it's cool to see like the local younger generation start to become more critical, start to pick up on these concepts and be a bit more critical in this province is pretty cool. And, a lot of them do listen to the podcast. So yeah, that's sort of like, I guess the light at the end of the tunnel for me is, my generation, we were still really dealing with a lot of blatant racism. But yeah, I have a lot of faith in like the young people who are sort of up and coming and having, the bit more grounded and founded conversations. You also painted this interesting picture where you said, that you might run into people or, obviously there's still people out there in the community, but in general, like what role do you think like education and awareness play in preventing people from getting involved with like harmful situations and groups like this? Like what kind of support do you think is needed for those who have been affected by them? Like how do we start to raise a consciousness about, this is going on, let's avoid it?
Sure. So first off, I mean, the government has a responsibility. If they're allowing these places to operate, they need to make sure that there's safety nets in place. So they have wildly failed on that front, because school should be generally a safe place. Obviously, things happen here and there in schools, but to have 4 decades of abuse victims from one institution is unacceptable. And right now, I mean, the positive with people coming forward to police is that some people have been able to get therapy for the first time because they've never been able to afford it, because they're able to access therapy through victim services. So that's huge. And I mean, the education piece, I think this has, I know this has been a wake up call to a lot of people, not just in Saskatchewan, but all over Canada, where we're identifying some of these key points of like, these are the things that really kind of change the dynamic from a religious organization to a cult. And I think it's caused a lot of people to sit back and be like, okay, like, am I involved in these, types of things? So, former students sharing their story, I think is a big part of that, because through human connection and hearing people's story, that's how people identify things in their life. So you can, say specific things and be like, these are the things you should look out for in a cult. But at the end of the day, like just hearing those human stories and hearing shared experiences, those are the things I think right now that are going to help people and help people who, there's so many people that have experienced the same type of traumas we've experienced. So knowing that they're not alone, because that is a big thing. A lot of former students have echoed that they felt like they were just isolated and by themselves in that experience and living with it every day and thinking about their experience every day, but feeling like they're the only ones out there like that. Because even as students, they would isolate us from each other. So we weren't allowed to complain. Like we were not allowed to say anything negative about the school or church, or you'd be paddled. So if something did happen, we might know that someone's in trouble, but we don't know what for. We don't know the details because they're not allowed to talk about it and you're not allowed to ask. So there's a lot of people just like suffering in silence and suffering in isolation.
Yeah, and that's what's wild. Can you give an update on that school for our listeners?
Well, they're still open. They're still open. They're still operating. The last couple of days, I've been talking in the news about the administrative reports that came out. So after articles came out, the government, just from social pressure, I would say, decided to put some government administrators in 3 schools in the province. And they ended up having to close one school because like within a week, because the one director, who was the director when I was in high school, he would not abide by the government rules at all. Now, this is a school, that school had been open since 2013. So that man has not been abiding by the rules since 2013. And
that's like a whole generation of kids.
yeah, it's ridiculous. And
Yeah.
there has been these inspections that the Minister of Education, Dustin Duncan, said, we're doing 3 inspections a school year. Well, I have those inspections and through
Hmm.
FOI, and they have not been doing 3 a year. They did 1 every fiscal year, if that. So that was a huge red flag. I mean, these schools have just been gone underregulated and overfunded for way too long.
Yeah, and that's a really valid argument to make too in terms of funding agreements, funding arrangements with the province from an Indigenous perspective. But what about the other schools?
So that was the one school. Now, Legacy Academy, it's still open. We got the administrative reports. They're still identifying, like, these people that were in the school, they're identifying some of the same issues. They may not be swinging a paddle at that school anymore, but the psychological, emotional abuse is still very much well and alive. And basic things like aligning the curriculum with provincial outcomes, that's literally in 2011 when the school received funding, Legacy Academy. That was in the reports from these inspections, was that the curriculum is not aligned, it's not on par, they shouldn't get funding. And then all of a sudden the next report is boom, they get funding, but their curriculum's still not aligned. So that was 2011. It's 2023. How do you not have the curriculum aligned at this point?
Yeah.
Like, that just is
True.
willful ignorance on the inspectors, and the government. There's other things too, like they were suspending a kid for something that happened on the weekend, at home. He was given by his parents permission to go somewhere, and another student saw it on Snapchat and told the pastor, and they suspended this kid.
Wow.
And
Wow.
it's like, that goes against the Education Act. You cannot suspend a child for something they did at home or in their own time. Like, that's not a thing. And so that was just another red flag. There was also in these inspection reports, that the school's running a huge surplus, which is ridiculous. So
Wow.
here we are, public education's begging for the bare minimum.
Yeah.
And we have these government funded cult schools that are running a surplus because they can charge tuition.
Yeah, totally. There's layers to this. There's conversations that we could go off and talk about because there's a very real ironies playing out. And then for me, what I'm trying to wrap my head around is, why do you think this is allowed to go on? Why do you think the Saskatchewan's not stepping in to the point that they should? Do you think the political interference is that deep?
Oh, for sure it is, because that's the voter base of the Conservatives in this province. And that's just the reality, is that there are a lot of, right-winged individuals who are very conservative in their beliefs, but that's Scott Moe's base. So, I mean, he's got an election coming up. He doesn't want to interfere or make any of those people question him. So I think that's why he's kind of been hands off. And I mean, with everything coming out now, though, I don't know how he can justify things. I mean, there's a lot of people that I know that have been longtime Sask Party supporters that are not anymore, and strictly just because of his handling of the school stuff. So, yeah.
Yeah, totally. I agree. And I that was my vibe too, was that in general, I feel like there is a conservative Christian base that wouldn't take too likely to Scott Moe closing or Saskatchewan putting pressure on a Christian school, with the general terminology being very general there.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that's the only reason why they're allowed to continue operating.
It's interesting. It's a really interesting conversation. So in terms of the advocacy work you've done, you brought this to light over the last few years. Like you said, you sat with it, reflected during the pandemic, all the balls rolling in terms of some court cases and things like that. How do you see your advocacy work evolving in the future? What are your next steps?
I don't really know yet. I mean, I would like to see there be some legislation in Saskatchewan in the future so that this doesn't happen again. And as a student group, that is really the driving force in why we came forward. And I think for a lot of people too, when they had children, because a lot of people in our student group have had children, you know, in the last 4 years or so. And that was a real big trigger for people having children and then thinking about their childhood experience and being like, holy crap, like how in the world could people have treated us like this? And so, I mean, I would love to see that in the future. Are we going to see that with the current government? Probably not. But all I can do is just keep pushing. I told Minister Duncan in, well, it was August of last year. I said, like, this isn't going away. Like, I'm not going to be quiet. This isn't something that it's like going to fizzle out in a few months. Like, this isn't going away. So I'm just going to keep calling it out as it comes down the line and hope that there are some safety nets put in place at some point where we don't have to keep doing this every few decades and seeing more abuse victims come forward. So
yeah, totally. I think that's where my heart goes to, is like the victims of this abuse. Like you said, the school's still open. So literally right now, as we're having this conversation, there's students at that school right now in the city today. And it's like, man, this is like, yeah, like yeah, obviously, you know, with my history and my relationship to colonialism, the impacts of residential school, like child abuse is like a big no-no, big trigger point for me, especially having daughters and children and working with children. So it's like, this is a societal problem that is not being addressed. So it is an ongoing injustice right now taking place. And I guess too, we didn't really we touched on it in the beginning and we didn't really put more voice to it, but you also, things got pretty risky there for a while this past winter. There was a fire at your house a week after ours. Yeah.
yeah. So I mean, since coming forward, there had been, you know, I'd gotten threats. I'd had a member of Mile 2 Church follow me, kind of corner me at my vehicle, really bizarre behavior. I'd had notes left on my deck. I'd had security cameras ripped down, put new security cameras up. I've been emailed threats because I have a public email on my social media. All things I just kept reporting to the police, and they basically, the one individual at Mile 2 from the church that followed me, the police did say, if you see that individual again, call 911 immediately. And I was like, oh, because there's a history there with this person, is there? And they were like, all we can tell you is I would take it as a serious threat, call 911. I was like, okay. So, so the law firm also reached out to Mile 2 and said, you need to decry this behavior. You need to tell your congregation. And they were like, didn't respond to it. So then fast forward a few months, my daughter was up, we were up fairly early, and she said, Mom, there's something on the house. And I was like, what? And so she's like, I think someone's spray painted our house. So we go look, and I couldn't see what it said until I got facing forward on it. And it was a scripture verse. It was the same scripture verse I had been emailed, and it's Hebrews, and it's God is an all consuming fire. So I called the RCMP, and when I called, they were like, yeah, we actually don't even have anybody on right now. Like, we have no officers. And I was like, okay, that's comforting. So then they said, we're going to send it to another detachment and see if we can get somebody out. I'm like, okay. So a guy finally comes about 4 hours later, and so I'm talking to him, and he's like, well, why would someone spray paint scripture on your house? Like, so I'm like, well, here's the articles, like, enjoy your read.
Yeah.
And he's reading the articles, and you can just see like his face change. And he's like, okay. And he's like, I'm going to need you to like write down all your kids' age, descriptions, what bedrooms they're in. And I'm like, because you think this is a like viable threat. And he was like, yeah. He's like, I do. He's like, these people sound insane by what I'm reading. So I was like, okay. So I the kids didn't have school. So we ended up going into the city, and we were going to have a little staycation, but I had my dogs. We have like a attached garage that has a dog run, so the dogs can go in and out. So I left my two big dogs there, and we came back the next, like, it was late afternoon, early evening, and to just feed the dogs, give them more water. And my nephew and I, like, we were in the house for like not even a minute, maybe, or 2 minutes. And we went downstairs because my nephew wanted to grab something, and we heard movement. And so we heard like feet on carpet, and I only have carpet in one small place upstairs and then the rest in the basement, like a thud kind of like hitting a wall. And I was already freaked out at that point from getting spray painted. So I like turned to my nephew and I'm like, did you hear that? He was like, if you heard feet on carpet and a thud, that's what I heard. And I'm like, okay, I'm not crazy. So I'm like, run. Because it was evident there was someone had broken into our house. So I get in the vehicle and I realized I left my cell phone sitting there. So I drove to the detachment, and I just, an officer banging on the door, no one's answering. An officer was coming around the building in a car. So I like flag him down, and I'm like, someone in my house. I just remember him saying like, well, who's in your house? And I'm like, I don't know, like someone broke in my house. And he's like, well, don't go back to your house. And I'm like, obviously. It was just like, and panicking a little bit too. Yeah. And so he's like, okay, he's like, I'm going to a call. He's like, I'm the only officer on. He's like, I'm waiting for another officer from another detachment. And he's like, I will get to your house at some point. Do not go back. So I'm like, okay. So then it was like around midnight, I got a message on Facebook on my computer from an RCMP from, I think it was a different detachment. And he was like, you got to call me right away. So call him. He's like, I don't know how to tell you this. Like, you got a house fire. And I'm like, nope, wrong person. I'm like, I called about the break and enter. And he's like, no. He's like, I'm pretty sure this is your house. There's pictures of you in it. He's like, you have red house, 2 big dogs. And I'm like, no, we had the break and enter. Like, I just could not, I was in total shock and just couldn't understand it. And yeah. And then I didn't like sleep for 2 days after, because I was like trying to process it. And then it was like trying to tell the kids too. I'm like, I don't even know how to tell my kids this. I have one son that I co-parent with his dad. And so I asked him to come over and my family, and sat the kids down and talked to them and just said, hey, like, this is what happened. I don't know what state the house is. I don't know what if we have any belongings. This is what happened. And they were all like, they started crying, but some of them were like, you know what, but we're alive, and I was like, yes, we're alive. Yay. That is the positive. And, it was trying to be really sensitive of their emotions.
Yeah. Then how did you fare through that? Like, what was your psychology and what were you going through?
It was really bizarre. And I think it took almost a month for me to actually have the emotional response to it, because I was just totally in shock for a while. And then it just hit me. And then I was like, oh, I'm not okay. And then my mental health just kind of took a dive. But I had the supports around me and people around me and professionals around me that I could reach out, thankfully, and access that. Because it's hard when you're the parent and you have all these little people to take care of. So you need to be on all the time, and having, this lawsuit, and you're the face of a lawsuit, and you're being strong for all these other students too. And then you have this go on. So it's like, I had to also allow myself to have that space to not be okay for a bit, and then work through that. So it was a bit of a go for a while.
Yeah. Did they ever find, like, is there a suspect, or did they ever find somebody? Or
doesn't really sound like they investigated, to be honest. Again, it's a manpower and capacity issue out there. So the last few conversations I've had with the RCMP, they've just been like, we have no new news. Like, we don't know anything. So it's like, appreciate, you guys being out there. I get that it's really tough right now, but capacity wise, but that's it.
Yeah. Do you feel that is directly correlated to the work you've been doing in terms of exposing the abuse at this school?
Oh, for sure it is. And, a week or two before the fire happened, there was a pastor in the States that actually got up on stage and threatened me, saying I'm going to lose my life, and saying a bunch of other things. And I didn't realize that, or I wasn't notified actually about this till I think it was the week after my fire, because people from that congregation somehow got a hold of my TikTok. And so then they put two and two together, because the pastor of our former church, of our church, Keith Johnson, he was actually at this church in Amarillo, Texas. And he was there with another pastor, and that it was the other pastor. So he was sitting in the congregation as this other pastor got up and said, he called me a demon, said that I was going to lose my life. And was like, I'm prophesying, drop the charges, and just like total Looney Tunes. So so people from Amarillo, Texas, who I do not know at all, started reaching out to me and was like, hey, we're really worried about you, and we're concerned, and we're not okay with our pastor having these individuals at our church. So that led into a whole thing where there was like 20 families that actually left that church. And because this pastor kept having Keith Johnson there to speak. So it's pretty interesting too, how this has moved. We knew there would be some involvement maybe with Texas, but having people in Texas who are still very religious standing up for us and standing up for me. And a lot of them have added me to social media, and I've been engaging with them for a long time. But, and them just saying like, this isn't okay. Like, this isn't what God is about, in our belief and whatever. And that's been really great to have that support too.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I know we got some listeners down in Texas too that listen to Radical Narrative.
Do you?
Yeah.
Oh boy.
Yeah. I won't say where specifically, but yeah, they're down there. So it's going to be interesting to hear this correlation come out to Texas with this school here in Saskatoon. Yeah. And then I guess that's lead me into the next question too, is how has your faith endured over this, like your relationship to God?
I mean, I have not practiced any sort of religion really, I would say, since I left, like that type of organized religion. I mean, as you know, like all of my children, I guess, in some form are, identify as First Nations, Indigenous. So we practice a combination of things, I guess, mostly around nature. And I definitely have participated more, in their culture and the beliefs in their culture than I have anything in 17 years. So that's kind of where we're at. And I mean, I've had before all of this came out, I mean, I had to sit my older kids down and be like, this isn't something we've talked about before, but this is something that happened, and this is what I went through. And so you're going to see this come out in the media. And I guess it was a good way to like speak with my children too about like, this is why, mom stands up for you so hard at school. And this is, and it's been having to find that balance of, anytime I'm in a school, I feel anxiety. And so, but I have 6 kids. So I'm, they're all in school, and it's that balance of like standing up for them, supporting them, but then at the same time realizing that, my trauma isn't their trauma. And so letting the teachers and staff have that space too. So it's a hard balance. And I think about the days where, like, for my mental health, I've kept my kids home because if there was something going on at school and I just didn't have the capacity to even begin to address it. And part of my trauma that's affected me, but it wasn't something that I didn't know I needed to address until I had kids. Because it was like, oh, now, it affects this part of my life. And sometimes, things come up over the years because it's different, it affects you in different ways and on the lifespan, different ways as you're going through developmental stages. So yeah. Yeah,
for sure. Definitely. And that's definitely relatable too, just in terms of like where I'm at with, raising 2 daughters who eventually have to go to school, have to engage with this society post-pandemic in Saskatchewan. And so that's why a lot of this stuff's pretty alarming, because I'm coming at things from like the perspective of being a father now too. And it's just like, it's a whole new chapter, obviously, but it's also like a whole new psychological shift and just like observing how the world works and functions. Yeah, I guess one question I want to ask too is, how can listeners support the work that you're doing, especially in terms of like holding those responsible for the abuse at school accountable, in terms of like politics, society, what's taking place in Saskatchewan politically? What are your thoughts on that?
One way is, I know it sounds cheesy and like, it seems like it doesn't do anything, but writing your MLAs, your premier, minister of education, and just telling him like, this is, I am a resident of Saskatchewan. This is not acceptable. That is a big thing. Always make sure you tag, though, in that email, somebody else so that that they've received it and they've gotten it. Because I have run into that where I've spoken in the media and said, hey, I emailed them on this date, and then the government has actually come back and said, no, you haven't. And then I show them their own response back to my email, thanking me for sending them an email.
Yeah, good strategy.
Also, just sharing on social media, that's a big thing. And just anytime students are sharing their story, if you're supportive of us and, supportive of us trying to cultivate this change, then please just, like, the encouraging words are what really has been the difference for some people coming forward, because that encouragement is something we never got, that positive encouragement. So especially from people that are considered like outside the bubble, because we were taught to fear these people, to fear anybody that wasn't us. So that part of things, just sharing encouragement, that's so huge. And there will be opportunities in the future, I think, to in person possibly support us. So we'll have more information on that later on. But right now it's just, really getting the articles out there, because there's still some people you'll get, it'll be one article and people will be like, how have I not heard about this yet? And then they're go down a rabbit hole and they're like, holy crap, there's 25 articles on this.
Totally. And your episode came from special requests from people in the area who want to know more about it because of that very reason.
Oh, wow.
Was not too many people heard about it,
yeah.
Or are seeing it. But then when they do, it's like, this is happening. And that was my experience with it too. It was like, oh, damn. Like, I went down the rabbit hole, and that's why I'm like, damn, this is like ongoing. This is right now. And so like you came, like some of our listeners said, yeah, get her on. Let's have a conversation with her. Just to highlight this too. So yeah, like social media is really, like, I think coming out more than, I don't know why people aren't seeing it. I don't know if it's like, I don't want to say like a shadow ban's taking place, but I think it's like just Saskatchewan's tendency to out of sight, out of mind it, but also, again, like just the political culture of this being a conservative province with a lot of, in general, Christians who are probably not wanting to touch this for various reasons.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with you. And I appreciate you having me on to talk about it. And, it is interesting, just, how people, I think too, obviously people are looking at news that supports their beliefs too. So you will see a certain demographic of people that don't listen to the news, but no, I really appreciate you having me on. You had great questions. So
yeah, it was great to have you on. I really appreciate everything you share with us and giving us an insight of what took place and what's taking place, what's ongoing. Closing questions, any like key readings, resources you would recommend our listeners to look into?
Resource wise, they're just, you can Google Legacy Christian Academy if you want to know more. Also the statement of claim. So our civil action is listed publicly at Sharfstein Law. So if you just look up Sharfstein's Law in Saskatoon, when you click on their website, it's just at the top of the page. And if you are a former student and you're listening to this and you're wondering how to join the lawsuit, all that information is on Sharfstein's page as well. The intake is posted there. So if you want to actually read the court document and see everything we're alleging in the class action, it's a very long document. It's a very, obviously, like, trigger warning because there's a lot of stuff in there. But the information is there.
Cool. And then we do have a lot of educators who listen to our podcast in general. What was the name of the curriculum that was being practiced and maintained there?
So it's called ACE, Accelerated Christian Education. And I've been doing some work just talking to other ministry of eds in other provinces and seeing what they're doing. And with this education, with this curriculum. And so far, every single province except for us in Manitoba do not view it as a curriculum that is up to standard.
Interesting and very telling. Very telling of the province we live in.
Yep.
Yeah. Cool. Any shout outs you want to give? Anything you'd like to add?
No, just I think, I have to reiterate again, I'm one person. I have a very large group of students behind me that do a lot of work behind the scenes and, help with letter writing and, doing different things. So I would not be able to do everything I'm doing without all of my former classmates rallying and coming behind me and beside me and, just being there. And like a lot of us have not spoken in decades. So it was just really interesting how quick everybody just all clicked back together, and I wouldn't be able to do this without them. And I have a huge support system. I have, a pretty amazing boyfriend who supports me, and he's very, I'm very thankful for him because it was something I had a discussion with and said, this might possibly be a thing down the road. I don't know. It could be big. It could be small. I don't think he thought it would be as big as it is. So, but huge support, him and his family, and my family too has been supportive. So, couldn't do it without them for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely. Well, thanks for sitting with us. I appreciate your time, and you gave us a lot to think about and even look into in terms of the province of Saskatchewan, Saskatoon, Legacy Christian Academy. A lot of information here to begin to reflect on.
Yeah, for sure.
Awesome. Thanks, Caitlin. Thanks for your time. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Take care, Mylan.
Take care.